Kamadat ventiv, niep amulians lysiamatics, iwans hotenta, mapipan nianyum nyats nahaps kamanskwatzan, niep shamulians nahar nahar. Greetings, my name is Lysiamatics. My heart is happy to see you here. I am from the Quetzal Indian Nation and I'm born for the Turtle Clan. I serve as the political director at NDN Collective, an Indigenous-led organization dedicated to building power for Indigenous people, and I'm very humbled to serve as your moderator today. Welcome to If You Know, You Know, the Power of the Native Vote. Just a couple of housekeeping items. Our panelists will walk us through their analyses, and we will have time at the end of our panel for questions. You can put your questions in the chat throughout the conversation, and I'll be monitoring those to ask them at the end. So let's begin. As we begin, it is important to know that going into 2020, American Indians and Alaska Natives were the highest undercounted population in the US at 4.9%. That is nearly double the undercount of the next population group. When we're invisible in the data and we're missing from the data, we're missing from key conversations and policies that affect our communities. So today we're speaking with a panel of advocates and experts in Indigenous movement building to talk to us about the efforts that led up to the high Native voter turnout in 2020 and to discuss how mobilizing and empowering Native people is positively affecting some of the biggest issues in Indian country. We'll also talk about some of the complexities around voting barriers and how we're entering what some call a new Indian policy era of truth and reconciliation. So please help me welcome Judith LeBlanc, the Director of Native Organizers Alliance, Chrissy Castro, Executive Director of California Native Vote Project, Jade Begay, Climate Justice Director at NDN Collective, and Michael Johnson, Director of Advancement. I'll give them a few moments to introduce themselves in their traditional way. Judith, if you want to start us off.
I will. My name is Judith LeBlanc. I'm a citizen of the Caddo Nation of Oklahoma, and I'm one of the 75 to 80% of Indians who walk with a high heel on one foot and a moccasin on the other. I'm urban, and when you're urban, you struggle to be on that path and maintain your connections with land and with place, but always with a hat that can never be severed from our people. I'm the Director of Native Organizers Alliance.
Thank you, Judith. Chrissy, let's hear from you.
Hi everyone, I'm Chrissy Castro. I'm Nakai Dene, born for Hanagani, or Mexican clan, born for the one who walks around clan. And I'm Navajo and Chicana, calling in from Tongva Territory, now called Los Angeles. As Licia shared, I'm the Executive Director of the California Native Vote Project and also one of the co-founders of Advancement Native Political Leadership. Thank you.
Thanks, Chrissy. Jade, you're up.
Thank you, Licia. Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Jade Begay. I am Dene Antisuka Pueblo, the Climate Justice Campaign Director at NDN Collective. Happy to be here.
Thanks, Jade. Michael, please go ahead.
Dosha relatives, allies, and comrades. Michael Johnson, Director of Advancement with the NDN Collective. I'm a citizen of the 3 affiliated tribes of North Dakota, and just really humbled and excited to be here with these amazing all-stars. So back to you, Lizzie.
Thank you very much, Michael. All right, so let's jump in. We want to start off with a reflection on 2020, and I'm sure everyone's asking why we want to do that. But we saw an incredible turnout of Native voters in 2020, and we should really talk about what drove them to the polls. I want to start with Chrissy. Tell us, what did it take to mobilize Native voters in 2020?
Thank you, Licia. First, I want to say how humbled I am to be on this panel with all of these amazing organizers. This is an all-star group, so just so happy to be with everyone today. And I also want to share that, I just want to start with a note of appreciation and say to each and every Native organizer, community leader, canvasser, digital organizer, communication specialist, volunteer, voter, all of those that made food, it was just, thank you. It was an all hands on deck moment. And our community across the country was up against incredible odds this last election cycle. We saw immense, suffering, devastation, loss of life due to the pandemic. We were part of the front lines of the country's racial reckoning. We were fighting like hell to make sure our people were counted during an extremely challenging and politically polarized census cycle. And we had our backs against the wall. And I am so happy and proud of us that we came out swinging. And what drove us to the polls was just that. We knew that, this was a very serious election. And if we didn't turn out, we knew what was on the line, and that was our lives and the lives of our loved ones. And so, we see incredible turnout in places like Navajo and Hopi in Arizona, some of the hardest hit during the pandemic, where last election cycle, 60,000 ballots were cast in those precincts, compared with about 40,000 in 2016. So that's a significant increase. Meanwhile, Biden won Arizona by less than 11,000 votes. So every election, we see examples such as this, where Native peoples are turning out and serving as the margin of victory in key states. And I'm proud of our communities because instead of being debilitated by the pandemic, we were inspired by it. The evidence of inequity and disparity was right in our faces. It was in our homes, and our people responded ferociously and were extremely resourceful and creative in turning out the vote. So instead of the usual tactics, there was every kind of brainstorm of any kind of way we could, turn out the vote, from phone banking and mass texting, radio advertisements in multiple languages, quickly scaling up and training our people on digital strategies. And of course, there was still a very, very strong and fair amount of in-person field work where digital just wouldn't cut it, because we still have a lot of lack of broadband access. So it was all of the networks. There was a beautiful network that had came to fruition as a result of census. So in a lot of ways, we were able to build on that network of outreach. And while I would love to hear other panelists' thoughts about specific state data and strategies that really worked. What I would really love everybody to hear that's joined us today is that what was done last election, in my opinion, is not sustainable, nor is it the way that we want to work. So we can't keep showing up and breaking our backs at the last minute for every election cycle. We need to invest in a long-term power building ecosystem that is going to be working on all cylinders all throughout the year. We need to have year-round voter engagement and organizing in Native communities in order for us to deepen and sustain our wins in off-election cycles. And there's so much money in political organizing work, yet community power building work only receives a fraction of philanthropic support. And I believe we really need to change that for the long term.
Thank you, Chrissy. That's an incredibly important analysis. Did anyone else want to chime in?
Well, I am totally in agreement with what Chrissy said. I think we've been preparing for generations for the moment that we're in, but it is not sustainable to just simply rely on our values and our commitment to our communities without having a way to sustain it. Everybody knew. You have asked, and we've spoken about how do people get prepared. Well, KXL was on the ballot. Police killings were on the ballot. The fact that we're denied treaty rights such as the right to health care, that was on the ballot. So people were very geared up. And I have to admit, there were amazing coalitions and collaborations, and it was just so uplifting. But the truth is that we had a lot of first-time participants in the electoral arena, first-timers. And therefore, there was a lot of creativity. There was innovation was the norm. We saw in places like that were hit very heavily by COVID, Menominee Reservation, Menominee County, the most infectious county in the state. But they worked, and they were able to achieve a 23% increase in the turnout of the vote. the groups, the tribe working together, and they did things like did voter registration on the line of cars that were waiting to get tested for COVID. And so I think that one of the lessons that we learned is how do you sustain 365 days a year engagement with policy, and really helping people understand the power they have by engaging with policy in an ongoing way. And frankly, not only has philanthropy not put the money into it, but I think the political parties as well have ignored the potential of the grassroots political power that exists in Indian country. They've always said we were statistically insignificant. Well, we showed in 2020 that we're politically significant. We've always been, but they never paid attention. Navajo Reservation, for example, has always had very high voting rates, higher than the national norm. And they increased that turnout in this most crucial election.
Thank you, Judith. Something that you said stuck with me, and that was innovation. And we know some of the most innovative of our population are our young voters. And I want to turn over to Jade. Jade, you made a specific effort in your SKO Vote Den campaign to target messaging toward Native youth and first-time voters. Tell us what you did and why.
Thanks, Licia. Yeah, so like most POC BIPOC communities, Indian country has a tumultuous relationship with the US, to say the least. And there's a lot of mistrust because, you know, every treaty has been broken. Administrations tend to fall short on their promises, like what's happening now, unfortunately. And not to mention, there's been policies that have literally attempted to terminate us as Indigenous peoples. So there's a lot of work to do around building inspiration, building motivation around getting out the vote in Indian country. And so that's why we started SKO Vote Den, it's a mini-series podcast about voting in Indian country, produced by NDN Collective, the organization that Michael, Licia, and I work with. And the podcast was really meant to be for us, by us, hence the name SKO Vote Den, which is a colloquial term for let's go or let's do this. Shout out to Reservation Dogs. There's a whole explanation in that series. I recommend going to check that out. But yeah, the podcast was really a way to talk about all the realities of voting in Indian country and really targeting young voters and millennials and Gen Z about why it's important to vote, but also acknowledging the nuances. There are there's definitely demographics within Indian country who either don't believe our vote matters or that to vote is to turn your back on the practice of decolonizing. And yeah, like I said, that's some really nuanced stuff, but it really needs to be discussed. It really needs to be acknowledged. And so, especially when we're doing our Get Out the Vote work. So the podcast just aimed at doing that. You know, Indigenous peoples are storytellers first and foremost. So we really wanted to just reach our folks, our young folks, especially in that format. And so, yeah, we talked with organizers, movement leaders, journalists, activists, and researchers on all these various topics that are being brought up today. And this was a podcast that ran from August of last year to through actually inauguration this past January. And right now it's on hold, but we definitely plan to get back on the air next year, right in time for midterms. And yeah, I think it's a really important project, not only to build narrative and share stories and discuss that nuance that exists within our own communities, but also to have our allies and have media listen in on these episodes to avoid, really harmful narratives like the CNN mishap with, kind of naming and generalizing all Native people as something else in their reporting on voting in Indian country. So that was one tactic we implemented last year around reaching our young folks.
Thank you so much, Jade. NDN Collective has such a fantastic platform, and making news by us for us is definitely working and helping to get our narratives in the mainstream. So Judith, we are going to transition over to you. Some of us in Indian country call you the mother of organizing, and we heard a lot about what it took to prepare organizers to meet this moment, and wanted to see if you want to elaborate on that, and then to also talk about some of those political and physical conditions that you saw in urban and rural tribal communities as you worked in that space, and then tell us any types of conclusions that you drew from that experience.
I think because of the funding problem where people dumped money late in the cycle because they were fearful of the outcome of the election, we were able to draw together 100 moccasins on the ground, working in 7 states, coordinating efforts, working with tribal governments, with community groups. And we found that there was an incredible awareness of our growing political power. And on election day, there were many of the people that we worked with were really, on one level, disappointed because they said, look how many people voted for Trump. And we said to them, look, election results are a snapshot of our political power at the moment. It's also a snapshot of their political power as well. And so that is the beginning, and that was the beginning of us being able to think through what does it mean to do voter engagement 365 days a year? Because the truth is, all the days in between the election days are the most important days to get people engaged in struggles, in movements, in taking actions. Because as Jade was saying, voting is not the norm in this country, inside and outside Indian country, although Indian voters are very highly mobilized and represented in past elections. This was a historically high vote. And I think one of the motivating factors was that we were taking our place beside the labor movement, beside the Black community, beside the Latino community, playing our role in mobilizing our people. And in some ways, no one would have foreseen that we would have the first American Indian as the Secretary of the Interior. And the truth is, though people were disappointed that so many people voted for Trump, even though it was a huge victory, the truth is that people realized right away, the organizers on the ground, that we couldn't just sit back, that in fact we had to get back saddled up and begin to push from the grassroots and tribal leadership levels for Deb to be nominated as the Secretary of the Interior. It was not a foregone conclusion. They wanted to go to the old boys network. They wanted Udall. But we mobilized, tribal leaderships mobilized, 19,000 people wrote letters to the transition team, and Deb was nominated. But it was not a foregone conclusion that she also would be confirmed. Again, had to get saddled up over. We worked with a coalition and we were able to mobilize over 40,000 letters to the Senate. Hardly any movement does that, but we knew we were fighting not only for representation, but for the political space that would be created if Auntie Deb was the Secretary of the Interior. So I just want to say that in some ways, the preparation for the elections has been in the works for some time, but it takes initiatives kind of catalyzing and organizing and mobilizing that power at the grassroots. And it takes resources, but most of all, it takes an understanding of the power of our values. Our values, Indigenous values frameworks, are a very, very potent force in the political arena because it gives us the hope and it gives us the energy to organize collective power. And that's what elections are all about, is exerting and showing on one day what our collective power looks like.
Thank you, Judith. You illustrated pretty well how the Native vote sort of spilled over into how this current administration is selecting key seat holders in areas. And so I think this is a great segue to start chopping it up and talking about political landscape for Indian country now. And my boy Michael is here, so really excited to have you to speak with about this. So in talking about the political landscape, we have an administration now that's more open to creating pathways for Native people, more so than we've seen in the past. And Judith alluded to Secretary Deb Haaland taking the seat at the Department of the Interior. So can you talk to us a little bit about, number one, what's the importance of Secretary Haaland overseeing the Department of the Interior and sort of the relationship that it controls with Indian country, or that it doesn't control, but has with Indian country. But and then give us some view right now of the political landscape with this administration.
Awesome. Thanks, Licia, and thank you guys all for your comments. One of the things that I'll dovetail into here is talking about there are persistent barriers for our communities to continue to engage in civic activity. And one of the things we saw in the last election was a lot of those barriers overcome. But a lot of those barriers are systemic, and they continue to need legislative solutions to them. So one of the things I'll talk about in a minute is the Native American Voting Rights Act. But to speak more to your point, it occurred to me as we were setting that up, I don't know if everybody knows that the Bureau of Indian Affairs used to be within the Department of War. It was actually in the Department of War for a long time, is where our federal government-to-government relationship was held as Indigenous sovereign nations, right? Only in recent times, maybe 80, 70 years ago, it was moved to the Department of Interior. And so you have to understand the whole context of how this relationship is set up in a war context, right? Our communities are meant to be marshaled over, not to be part of the democracy. And this is one of the amazing things about American democracy, is it does create parity for people with the power to engage the system, right? And I think what my colleagues were speaking on a lot here in the last election last year had a lot to do with our agency being threatened as a population and our ability to engage in a variety of different, like, single issue voter engagements and a lot of other kinds of issues, right? If we look to the amazing research that came out from Illuminative on the Indigenous Futures Survey last year, one of the things we know for certain is that civically engaged Native voters, 80% of their vote decision is based on the track record of a candidate supporting Indigenous issues. So it is very much to the Native Organizers Alliance and Illuminative's seminal research project, the Indigenous Futures Project, being able to speak to Native issues is going to be paramount for progressive candidates going forward if they want to consider us part of their bloc politic and part of the votes that they can count on to get elected. So with the Biden administration opening the doors better and creating more access and more visibility for Indigenous professionals like Deb to come in and take on the role of secretary, or whether it's people like Natalie Landreth, who is working at the BLM as the director of land, or Dan Cordalis, who's working at the BLM as the director of water. we're seeing a higher number of appointees and positioned federal employees coming out of Indian country with lived experience from their communities, from the work that they've done in the past. And I feel really positive about this because it's A, it's about access, B, it's about visibility, C, it's about normalizing the kinds of relationships and the kinds of issues that Indigenous people are facing and how we can all work together to solve this stuff. So I see all this as a really, really positive thing. Now, looking forward, right, there's a lot of tricks in the hopper right now. We're going to go into a midterm election with a refreshed redistricting strategy that is taking on the census in a handful of really important swing states. What's cool from an Indigenous perspective is we're in the mix in a lot of these places that are currently under redistricting, right? The sad reality is these districts have already been gerrymandered and stacked and cracked in a variety of different ways and in different spaces all over the states, right? And I think that furthers the importance and the priority of the Native American Voting Rights Act to protect our block politics, to be able to play in a balanced kind of district way in democracy, right? So some of the stuff I'm seeing coming down the pike right now, Arizona is going through a redistricting at the moment. 49 different district plans are on the table right now for them all to figure out. It's a mess if you go and look at the website. Some of them are super scary for BIPOC and lower socioeconomic communities. It's ridiculous stuff. So those are things to watch closely. I would also say, there's some heavy redistricting happening in Alaska, South Dakota, Montana, New Mexico, and Minnesota. So these are all places that we need to be watching that I would throw out, and I would love to highlight. The Native American Rights Fund has a Native American Voting Rights Coalition. They have a website. I think it's vote.narf.org. They have created toolkits for community members to get involved with these redistricting conversations in these different states. So if you're in one of those states, you want to help your community maintain the agency and the vote that was fought so hard for in the 2020 election, there's some tools out there that you guys can leverage. And lastly, one of the things I wanted to echo was a point that Chrissy brought up and also that Judith was talking about. Because of the lack of engagement and because of the redlining that's happened in our communities, we don't necessarily have all of the infrastructure to do these projects when we need to do them, i.e. in the 11th hour to activate a community. So one of the big things we have to think about going forward is how are we creating sustainable funding for the infrastructure in Indian country to continue to mobilize and politicize our people towards the issues that we're facing, right? And so I continue to come back and think about how environmental issues are a great driver in Indian country. Education is a great driver in Indian country, as well as, big picture kind of sovereignty and self-determination. And I think it would behoove candidates coming out of their primaries and getting on the ballot this coming November to really think hard about what they can do in partnership with their tribal communities and their constituency. Check.
Thank you, Michael. That was an amazing analysis there. And you mentioned some really important states that mean a lot to various populations. You said Arizona, Montana, South Dakota. We know that Oklahoma is going to be a key area. And Chrissy is a resident to a state that has one of the highest Native voter populations that are in this country, self-identified Native voter populations. So really, really important. Thank you so much for taking us through that, Michael. And really, you're talking about seeing more Native people in positions of power, in positions of decision-making. And so I want to transition over to talking about what that means for government to government relations and how that could potentially mean going from consultation to consent. And Judith, I know that you've been doing a lot of work in this area, and we are entering what the president of the National Congress of American Indians referred to as the era of truth and reconciliation. We're seeing that come to life, and we're seeing a reckoning here in this really big moment of racial equity. And it's a huge moment for tribal nations because we could truly experience some of the strongest versions of government to government relationships here. So what do Indigenous people mean by self-determination? Why is government to government relationships important to that? What are we self-determining? And how will these relationships advance self-determination, Judith?
So I think self-determination flows from our unique legal and inherent position in this country, and the fact that there's over 500 nations within this nation, tribal nations, and that we have a unique relationship to the federal government because of treaties, which are constitutionally guaranteed. We have treaty rights that even under a right-wing dominated Supreme Court continue to be upheld, such as fishing and even policing, all kinds of rights that are protected by our special relationship. So when we talk about self-determination, we're really talking about how do we move forward, because to meet the needs of Indian country, because we are the only peoples who have collectively owned land that's self-governed since the beginning of time. And so for the 21st century organizing that we're doing, self-determination and sovereignty means, plain and simple, being at the decision-making table, not being consulted, but actually giving or taking away our consent. Now, free, prior, informed consent is a UN standard in the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. It's a UN standard that nation-nation relationships should be based on the right to prior informed consent. And the truth is that in this country, not only, as Michael outlined, the history of the Department of Interior has been a long and sordid one, but let's sit with this. We're the only peoples in this country that are in the same department as endangered species of animals. We're competing in the budget fights against, protection of the gray wolves, funding for that kind of work, and it's being taken from budgets on Indian Health Service, Indian education, tribal governance. So when we talk about going from consultation to consent, we're talking about the fact that since the Clinton administration, there has been kind of the norm set that the tribes should be consulted about infrastructure projects, about decisions. The truth is they could or they couldn't. That's been going on since Clinton administration. But consultation as an idea or a form of relationship between our nations and the federal government has become weaponized. Because more often than not, they don't consult us. We saw that at Dakota Access Pipeline. The tribe was consulted and then ignored, or the KXL pipeline. So what we need is to be at the decision-making table. That's what consent is all about. And the truth is that, President Biden did an executive order asking all departments to create a plan for consultation. All of the departments of the government, first time in history. Amazing. But the truth is this. Will they? Did they? Until it's a law, until they're mandated, it'll remain the same. So right now there is a bill in Congress, the Respect Act, that was introduced originally by Congresswoman Deb Haaland and Congressman Rahul Grijalva from Arizona, and it's been reintroduced. And we're about to put together a major campaign to push for its passage. Why? Because it takes us to consent? No. It's a big structural reform because it would make it a law that every department has to consult tribal nations on decisions being made that affect us, our lives, and our land. And this is the thing. For the Indian grassroots political power, Native grassroots political power to continue to be organized and built, we have to understand that structural reforms are necessary. but they have to be fought in a strategic way so we never lose sight of the horizon. We want consent. We deserve consent. Our treaties are legally and morally and inherent binding documents to give us, recognize our inherent rights to be caretakers of this land, of this water, to be caretakers of all the peoples, to govern for the whole. And that's the power of Deb being the Secretary of the Interior. She's governing for the whole. She's bringing our values, Indigenous framework to bear on government policy. And frankly, if an Indigenous framework was used to respond to climate change, to deal with the problems, the crisis problem of COVID, it would have a whole other flavor because we're in the middle of an aha moment. The health of people in Wuhan or Lima, Peru, or Johannesburg is as important as our own personal health because we're all related. So the issue of going from consultation to consent, we got to get consultation as mandated and a law, and then we will continue that fight for the victory of being at the decision-making table.
Thank you, Judith. That is really important. And a couple of things that you were touching on were self-determination and values and relations. And so I want to give Jade the opportunity to kind of unpack that a little bit more for us. So Jade, in the Vine Deloria Jr. and Daniel R. Wildcat book, Power and Place, the authors say that Indigenous self-determination begins with attentiveness to the relations around us, whether they be typically understood as economic, political, ecological, or spiritual. They also unpack the struggle that society created when we segregate and compartmentalize human actions and experiences in this world. And your climate justice campaign thoughtfully argues the importance of consequences, and it lifts up the experiences of Indigenous communities and how the decisions of our land and resources every day. And it also asks that we envision a world where our communities and our land are coexisting in a state of liberation. So talk to us about a little bit more about that. Let's unpack that. Talk about climate justice and Indigenous power and how climate justice influences how you're talking about the power of voting.
Thanks, Licia. Well, climate justice, the way I see it as a climate justice organizer, is that it's like the great connector of the movements right now, right? It's climate justice is racial equity, climate justice is food sovereignty, it's consent, as Judith was mentioning earlier. And I think, right now, again, just building on what Judith was saying, to achieve climate justice, we need to flex our collective power. So connecting back to, getting out the Native vote, we need to show up. We need to keep fossil fuels in the ground. And that's going to happen by continuing to put pressure on our elected leaders, and also getting our own folks in leadership roles. We've been talking a lot about mobilizing our communities to get out and vote. We've been talking a lot about Deb, anti-Deb, but we can have more Debs. We need to have more Debs, and that happens as we, as much as we build each other up, support Indigenous leadership at the grassroots level, encourage our young people to become leaders and invest in them. And so that's, something I'm really excited about in the work that we do here at Andean Collective is supporting and investing in our Indigenous leaders, so that we can be getting out the vote, but not just for, someone from outside of our community, but someone who really understands, and as Judith was saying, who understands our values and who can apply our Indigenous values to policy making, to lawmaking. I think, right now, and then connecting it back to some other some other policy actions. Judith was mentioning the Respect Act. Right now, we're also, mobilizing our people for the reconciliation package, making sure that we're seeing, no false solutions there, ending fossil fuel subsidies. We're pushing for a civilian climate corps to make sure that our people from BIPOC and POC communities are managing lands and resources, and we're building jobs for people from our communities. So I really see climate justice as very intersectional work, and work that is just about investing in our communities and our people.
Thank you, Jade. And I think this is a really great segue because we have someone on this panel that is working on investing in more representation. Chrissy Castro, I want to go over to you and hear a little bit about how we're prepping Native candidates. And, we're hearing a lot of chatter about voting rights during the off-cycle year. So if you want to tell us a little bit about the voting rights bill that Michael alluded to earlier.
Absolutely. Thank you. And, being on this panel, I just have to say that I really miss being in person because I feel like I just want to have and sit for like hours and just bat around all these ideas and talk about 2022 with my brothers and sisters here. And with all of you, I know we really don't have a sense of how many people are listening in right now, or, the exchange is just not exactly. So I really am hoping that we're able to come together in person sooner than later so we can have, even a fuller and more rich conversation. But so much to talk about. With regard to, what Advanced Native Political Leadership is up to, want to share that previous to Advanced Native Political Leadership, there really wasn't necessarily like a political home for, recruiting, getting Native electeds prepared, networking them and helping them to support one another with governance, infrastructure and ecosystem once they're elected. We had done a lot of focus groups and talked to a lot of Native elected leaders, folks who ran, who didn't win, folks that were part of the, campaign management team, and really just the whole system. And overarching, what we heard back was that experience is a very isolating experience, and people are often having to figure it out all by themselves. And then, once the election happens, folks are winning against all odds to put against them. And then it's also incredibly isolating once folks are elected. So Advanced Native Political Leadership is seeking to really change that, and to really, for Native people to see ourselves as taking our rightful place in this whole ecosystem of what we now know as the political structure that is governing these lands. And really part of that is to rematriate leadership in this country. As we know, the overwhelming demographic of political leaders in this country is typically white and male, and also that there's systemic structures that really prevent people, not only Native peoples, but all peoples that are not inherently wealthy, are not retired, from actually serving in a capacity of leadership. So for example, places like New Mexico, they have no salary for a legislator. So these kind of structural systems are really stacked against us if you don't fit a particular demographic. And so Advanced Native Political Leadership is seeking to really create, build relationships across the Indian country ecosystem, so that we're starting to recruit and identify leaders who probably are the exact right leaders that we need, but don't necessarily see themselves in those roles, because what we see now is something we're disgusted with. We're disgusted with corporate money in politics. We're disgusted with people making decisions for their own political careers and not for the people. And so what we're trying to do is really change the face of how we see ourselves in leadership, where we see that we belong, and really to reinfuse Indigenous value systems within this very sick political structure. That is a very tall order. And we know that we're brilliant. We know that we've been leading since time immemorial on these lands, and that our Indigenous value systems and the way that we have led allowed us to actually sustain these lands in a beautifully powerful way. And so we believe that it's the right of the land to have our value systems once again govern this place, not only for Native peoples, but for all peoples. And so that is the vision of advanced Native political leadership. I also want to share, this thought about, just pick up the thread of what I was hearing with regard to, why we're voting. When we talk about integrated, we use this word integrated voter engagement, which when I first started in this work, I thought it meant, the vote work is lined up right against the organizing work, and those things go hand in hand. And I actually, now see that differently. I really do think that community organizing, relationship building, leadership development, that's the heart of the work. That's what's happening every day, day in and day out. And then what happens is there's policy and legislative cycles, there's election cycles, there's these other things that get braided on as inflection points. And I can't speak to how important that is, because as we talk to Native voters, and I'm working in my home state of now called California, when we talk to Native voters, we're not getting folks to turn out or to register even to vote because it's a civic duty or because it's like what we should be doing as our responsibility. It's really about talking to folks about issues they care about. It's about, people would say, oh, I don't vote, I don't believe in the system. And we're like, yeah, we have a lot of criticisms as well, but did you know that education's on the ballot? Did you know that healthcare access is on the ballot? So, right, we talk to people about the issues that they care about and basically link that up to, why we should engage. But we definitely don't start there. It's just like a one small and important action that folks can take. But we engage folks in the whole process. So we want to recruit volunteers. We want to get folks to start reaching out by text and phone to their family members and loved ones. So that we're really creating this whole infrastructure of relationship that can not only activate for elections, but really that we're activating at the city council meeting, that we're activating at the school district meeting, that we're activating at the water commission. So it's really that we're seeking to do something that's much more comprehensive in our community, and folks love it, really. Like folks, as we do phone banking up and down the state of California, we just did it for the recall election. They try to boot out our governor. It failed, but we've basically took it as like we're building that muscle of Native voter participation for 2022. So it was like almost like a test run, right? We continue to build that voting muscle. And folks when we talk to them, they're like, wow, a Native person is calling me about elections work. Oh yeah, I do have a question. My ballot is here and now I'm moving here. What do I do? So there are, members of our community that rightly have a lot of criticisms of the system. And what we say is that we can still hold that criticism and we can still exercise our power. Like we don't have to choose one or the other. We can do all of it at the same time. And we really need to do that. And so, some of the other secondary benefits, and this will be my last point because I know we want to go to Q&A, but in a place like California, although we have the largest population of Native peoples, I think of any other state, that may have changed from the census. I may not be completely accurate on that, but at least one of the largest concentrations. But that's because California is also such a huge behemoth of population size. So our ratio is pretty small as far as like flexing our electoral power up and down the state. But what getting involved in electoral justice work has allowed us to do is actually to build relationships with multiracial justice coalitions so that we're actually able to start to infuse our way of looking at the world. We're able to share our vantage points about issues with other communities that do have robust population population size and political power. And so it's been really critical in that regard. And the second thing that I'll say is that it has allowed us an entry point to start to create a database for organizing of identifying Native voters up and down the state. So, you know, COVID, as awful as it's been, we had to get creative on some kinds of things. So for example, California, we have a very geographically dispersed Native population. So it's very, very difficult to organize when it's one Native family in every, like, you know, there's one Native family in a census, district. And what we've been able to do is use a digital organizing strategy to actually have people sign up for various issue campaigns that we have happening across the state. And then we ask folks if they're Native American. So we've been able to, through a digital organizing strategy, build a base of 15,000 Native American peoples during COVID who are taking action across a number of issues throughout the state. And so, I also want to say that the electoral integrated voter engagement strategy is not just for vote in itself. There are a lot of secondary, benefits as organizers that we have. So I'll stop there and hand this back to our facilitator. And I could talk about this all day. So
I know you were on fire, girl. I was about to put some pumpkin spice on it and just call it all good. So yes, love that. Thank you so, so much for breaking that down for us. I think it's incredibly important. I mean, and look, American Indian, Alaska Native people are a political status. So we don't have a choice but to engage in this process if we really, truly want to be exercising that sovereign muscle that we have in California, 109 federally recognized tribes, but dozens of unrecognized tribes that still have that culture and that thriving identity that they have out there. So that's awesome. We have a little bit less than 10 minutes left. We only have one question in the queue right now. And so I encourage everyone that is looking to ask a question to any of our esteemed panelists here to please drop your question into the chat. The question that we have here is wondering how organized labor can support Indigenous people, especially in the Pacific Northwest. So I'm not sure who's willing to answer that question here, but any of our panelists want to take a pass at that?
Oh, let me take a bite and then I'll pass the plate to someone else. I think the most important role that labor can play, especially in the Northwest, is to support Native candidates. You have such opportunities right now to seek them out in your own membership. There's a Native American caucus within the Labor Federation, the County Labor Federation in Seattle. So there are Indian workers in labor who could be candidates, but to also reach out into the community. I know in Minnesota, the many Indian candidates that were elected there were because of labor's support and endorsement. So that's one thing. The second thing is really for labor to be more involved in discussing the impact of fossil fuel extractive industries, to try to help their members understand that we've got to think about our descendants, and we've got to begin a transition. We don't want to destroy jobs. We want a transition that takes care of the people who've been, sucked dry, their labor sucked dry for the profits of fossil fuel industries, and make a transition that takes care of them so that they can get retrained, but also takes care of Mother Earth. And that will open up a whole level of democratic engagement on policy issues in the labor movement, which the labor movement has stood back from or had actively opposed certain campaigns like Line 3 in the Mississippi headwaters in northern Minnesota, where they've taken a side and they're putting a lot of resources in full-page ads, and they're using their political clout to try to sway and pressure the Democratic governor of Minnesota. And they've been effective because labor movement is critical to the electoral system. They are the most organized force in this society. So you all have a lot of work to do, and any way we can help you, we're dying to.
Thank you so much, Judith. And you make a really good point. I just want to kick it over to Jade really quickly before we do some closing thoughts. Tell us about the recent report that came out talking about sort of the status of our climate right now and why it's so important, especially for the Northwest and, you know, various everywhere in the world to be thinking about climate solutions.
Sure. Well, it was a 3,000-page report, so I'll try to sum it up in a couple moments. I mean, the gist of it is that we are in code red. We have passed the point of really preventing the climate crisis. We are in the climate crisis. That is what the report, the bottom line of it, or the top line message of it is that the climate crisis is here for the next from now till 2030. We're going to be experiencing extremely harsh climate impacts, whether that be wildfire, drought, permafrost loss, therefore flooding, more extreme weather. So right now, although that's, you know, the harsh reality, there's also this very small window of opportunity, and that is to have large-scale emission reductions. So this point about the just transition, about moving away from fossil fuels, keeping fossil fuels in the ground, is extremely important. We can really only achieve large-scale emission reductions if you know the administration and the oil industry is stopped. If there are you know, executive orders taken to stop Line 3, executive orders to stop Dakota Access Pipeline. So this is something, like Judith said, we need a lot of support on from not just labor groups, but from all of our allies and partners, you know, across the movement ecosystem. If we take that action now, we have a good fighting chance at having a thriving-ish ecosystem, or just planet past the 2050 mark. But if we miss that window between, I would say, now and the next 5 years, we are certainly looking at ecological collapse. So now is a really important time to put that pressure on. We're only a month away from the climate negotiations in Glasgow, Scotland, and so we really need all of our movement partners and allies to be pressuring the Biden administration and world leaders really to take the most serious, bold climate action that they've ever taken. Otherwise, it's just not looking great, and this impacts everybody. And as we've learned from the past year, you know, climate change does not discriminate. It impacts everybody on the planet.
Thank you so much. So for anyone viewing here, you know, that's a fight for all of us. It's not just an Indigenous people's fight. So we're rounding about 2 minutes left here, and I just want to kick it back over for some closing thoughts. We're going to start with you, Michael.
Thanks. I was just writing down some stuff here. I think some of the things I'm thinking of as we leave this time together, just a big ups and thanks to my fellow panelists. You guys are amazing. I learn so much from you every time we talk, so thank you so much. I think that there's a point here to be made about diverse democracy being a strong democracy, and creating parity and equality in this system. And this idea in America is one of the highest forms of governance that we as the people can take on for ourselves. I don't think you can understate that. And I would ask, you know, for all of our Native organizers and the people who are civically engaged in our community, do a +1. Find someone, bring along with you. I would ask our allies, find ways to plug in, to disseminate, amplify, and hold up Indigenous voices in your district and communities. Do ride shares, help with the street game, get out there. The democracy is ours to lose. the democracy is ours to manage, right? And so with that, I just say thanks again.
Thank you so much. And I see that we are up at time here. So I just want to thank all of you for your time today and your wonderful insight. And we hope that our audience is walking away with a few key insights. And we hope that you've gained a better understanding of the movement that's happening in Indian country and the mobilization that is happening. So we thank you for joining us today. Please visit the resources that we dropped in the chat. And we hope that you all will continue supporting this movement. Yaha.